US-European relations under severe strain just 2 months into Donald Trump's second term. Major divisions over NATO, the Russia-Ukraine war, Greenland and trade, with European leaders scrambling to react. What's driving these differences and what's next? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Adrian Finighan. The US is one of our closest partners and we're committed to strengthening the transatlantic bond. Those were the words of European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen on January 9th. She's got her work cut out, it would seem, given how quickly relations have nosedived since Donald Trump returned to the White House a few weeks later. Rapprochement with Russia and its President Vladimir Putin, talks on the war in Ukraine, excluding the EU and UK, and plans to annex Greenland have all had European leaders scrambling to react. The future of NATO is under scrutiny, with President Trump accusing Europe of freeloading on defence. While the US and Europe have been the biggest backers of Israel's genocide in Gaza, it's difficult to find other current areas of common ground. So what's driving all of this? And is this a political rift that will disappear, or a serious ideological fault line, fissuring what's been the bedrock of Western geopolitical architecture for a century and more? We'll speak to our guests on both sides of the Atlantic shortly, but first a report from Laura Khan.
The trip to Greenland by US Vice President J.D. Vance is another sign of the increasingly frosty relations between the US and Europe. During a visit to the Bidufig base, he accused Denmark of underinvesting in the territory's security, saying the US could provide better protection. Since returning to office, President Donald Trump has reiterated his desire to acquire the self-governing island, which is part of Denmark. It prompted the Danish Prime Minister to issue a statement of European solidarity directed at President Trump.
With great support from the European partners and the European Union, that everybody has to respect the sovereignty of all national states in the world, and it's not for sale.
More recently, in barely veiled criticism of the US, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen told Italian media the Arctic island deserves partners that respect them and treat them as equals. She was among EU leaders who gathered in Paris to discuss military support for Ukraine. The third such summit since President Trump departed from US policy on Russia's war in Ukraine and engaged in direct talks with Vladimir Putin. Their relationship is seen as a possible threat to NATO and one that could leave Europe vulnerable to attack. President Putin considers the alliance one of Russia's greatest threats, and Trump has accused European members of not paying their fair share towards NATO's defences, warning the US might abandon its commitments. Now European allies are preparing for all eventualities, bolstering defence spending while throwing their support behind Ukraine.
This is a European initiative about expanding Ukraine's access to intelligence, on access to relevant technologies and satellites that our European colleagues have. Then we agreed with some leaders about Ukraine's access to their ammunition depots.
Back in Greenland, crowds protested against Vance's visit. His combative remarks about Europe extend well beyond Arctic security. Leaked text messages about US attacks on Yemen's Houthis included a comment from Vance that he hated bailing out Europe again, possibly referring to US protection of international shipping lanes. President Trump has also made it clear that using military force to acquire Greenland is not out of the question, departing from the core NATO principle that an attack against one NATO country is an attack against all. But this time the threat could come from an ally. Laura Khan, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Let's bring in our guests. Niall Stanage is a White House columnist at The Hill newspaper. He joins us from Washington, D.C. Theresa Fallon is the director of the Centre for Russia-Europe-Asia Studies. She joins us from Brussels. And Stephen Erlanger is in Berlin. He's the chief diplomatic correspondent in Europe for the New York Times. A warm welcome to you all. Niall, let's start with you. How did we get here, and so quickly. Is the historic alliance between the US and Europe disintegrating? What's behind this apparent dismissive contempt for Europe coming out of Washington right now?
I think that traditional alliance is certainly unraveling. And I think it has taken people in Europe perhaps more by surprise than it has here in the United States. Because President Trump has been pretty clear, and was clear while he was campaigning, about his skepticism of the European Union, of NATO, of multilateralism generally. The question of how we got here would take us the entire show and longer to get into, but I do think it is worth mentioning one factor that I think is underplayed in coverage of all this, and it's the effect in the United States of the legacy of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Those were wars that cost the United States financially and obviously in terms of the lives of members of the military. And the communities from which President Trump draws his support were among the hardest hit, a lot of military families and so forth. That, I think, has led to a broader isolationism. So it's not just about debating the rights and wrongs of the US going into Iraq and Afghanistan. I think it has fed into this sense that the problems of the wider world are for the wider world to sort out. And we have seen this American pullback from its traditional positions.
Theresa, do you agree with that? Is the alliance between the US and Europe unraveling? Does the Trump administration now view Europe as a political, strategic and ideological rival?
Well, I think that we have to just take a deep breath here. I know a lot of people are running around like their hair's on fire, but there has been an 80-year alliance, and I think that's one of the most successful alliances in the world. Is Donald Trump's tone tough for the Europeans to hear? Yes, it is. And I think that we could describe perhaps the transatlantic relationship right now as someone having an affair and then you're trying to mend the relationship. But we should look at what the relationship has, which is incredible economic ties, investment in each other's economies, and the most successful defense alliance. So it's clear that the Trump shock, unlike the Putin shock with the war in Ukraine, might finally be waking up Europe, because we're seeing much more discussion on increased defense spending, which is, I think, one of the key irritants in the Trump transatlantic relationship, how he perceives the EU. And we could even see that in the signal messages that J.D. Vance put. But the visit to Greenland, I think, is quite interesting, because J.D. Vance even said that everyone has been kind of ignoring the interests of the Arctic, and that there's been a 30-year pause. I mean, everyone has been kind of using the peace dividend. And of course, the idea of cheap riding in Europe has been a huge problem. And it's not just the Trump administration. There have been 4 U.S. presidents saying the same exact thing, that the Europeans haven't been spending enough on defense. And let's face it, in 2014, all of the members of NATO agreed to 2%, and they haven't reached that. I mean, they've accelerated that, which is a good thing, but there are still 6 members that haven't even reached that. And at the next summit, most are expecting it will be raised to between 3 and 4%. So this is going to be very difficult, because at the same time, Europe's economy has been in decline. They have a very strong social system, but spending on defense is going to be another guns and butter debate. And they understand they need to spend more on defense, and it's going to take a long time to do that. So about 10 years. So they can't just abandon the transatlantic relationship. They really do need the US. But if we look long-term in a very charitable view, this could deepen transatlantic relations, because Europe will finally be spending the money necessary and have a diverse defense base, which the US really wants to see in the future. And I would just add that Trump isn't going to be around forever. So I think that calm heads have to prevail. But I think President Trump has really hit on a key issue, that Europe has really been kind of free riding, and they need to think longer term about strategic defense spending.
Stephen, do you agree with that? How much of this, I wonder, is Trump bluster and showmanship designed mostly for a domestic US audience and his MAGA supporters?
On some of these issues, I think it's deeply held. I mean, he's thought many of the same things for the last 40 years before he ever became a politician. He doesn't like multilateral institutions, whether it's the UN or the EU or even NATO. He thinks they take advantage of the United States. He looks at Europe, I use the phrase, a geopolitical parasite. He feels that the US has been made a chump by its allies who have been living off American money while they've been building up wonderful social welfare systems. So this is part of it. But he has said, and I think he means it, that he supports NATO, he supports Article 5, he intends to keep the American nuclear umbrella over NATO. He says, and Hegseth, his defense secretary, said this very explicitly, we have other interests, both domestically and in Asia, and it is time for a very rich Europe to take the bulk of responsibility for conventional deterrence and for Ukraine. And that's been something I think the Europeans in a way have understood ever since Congress hesitated on $61 billion of money for Ukraine, even under President Biden. And it is true, as Theresa said, they seem to have gotten the message. Now, Europe isn't always united on this. Countries like Poland, who are near Russia, want desperately to keep the Americans involved. And it has to be a slow and cooperative process because the US is the central skeleton to the NATO alliance. If you pull that out, the body dies. I don't think anybody wants that to happen.
Niall, other than Europe falling into line and acquiescing to US demands, what needs to happen to stop this unravelling that you say is happening? Can it be saved as long as Trump is in power? And has the US been made a chump by its European allies?
In relation to the chump question, the chump and Trump question, look, I think there is a valid point to be made about NATO members under contributing to the defence budgets of those of the overall alliance. We are now seeing that changing in the United Kingdom, for example, which is already over the 2% threshold. The Prime Minister Keir Starmer has announced plans to bring it from 2.3% to 2.5%, ultimately to 3%. I think, though, the bigger issue inherent in the question is the view by President Trump, which tends to look at almost all relations, domestic or international, in transactional terms. Is the United States being conned? Is the United States being taken advantage of? How much money is the US providing rather than Europe? He has, for example, consistently overstated the amount of aid that the United States has given to Ukraine. So that is part of his overall worldview, and how Europe mitigates that is not entirely clear to me, because talk about, say, the broader picture, you know, the Western interest, for example, in discouraging Russia from an invasion of a sovereign neighbor. Mr. Trump rarely mentions the fact that Russia launched an invasion of Ukraine. He has, in fact, said that Ukraine started it, presumably alluding to Ukraine's wish to be involved with NATO or to, I don't know exactly what, perhaps NATO expansionism. So his own rhetoric does not really provide an enormous amount of common ground or encouragement for the kind of revitalization of the alliance that I think your question is getting at.
Theresa, we talked about Ursula von der Leyen at the beginning of the programme, saying that the US is one of our closest partners. We're committed to strengthening that bond back in early January. How dizzying have the last 2 months been for Europe's leaders and its people? Are they now coming to see the US perhaps as an adversary and not as an ally?
Well, I really vacillate between these two optimistic and pessimistic viewpoints, because in Brussels here, many people see the US as an adversary now. Now, not everybody, but that's a big turnaround. And President Donald Trump has said the EU is designed to to screw America. So I don't think that that's really the case. Nevertheless, I think that, this is kind of a low point in transatlantic relations. But I think that we're seeing a lot of coming together within the EU. And I think that over the longer term, this will be a good thing. The strengthening of NATO, it's really clear that that's one of the key issues, that they haven't been spending enough on defense. Now that we have the tariff issues, which is also going to be an economic kind of issue that's going forward between the US and Europe. And I think that Trump's rhetoric towards Europe really shows that he isn't very sympathetic towards them. Nevertheless, I think that if you just want to get, I often wonder, why does Trump really dislike the EU so much? As Stephen mentioned, he doesn't like multilateral institutions, but there's also a little anecdote I want to share with you. He has a golf course in Ireland on the West Coast, and it was being destroyed by the sea. He was losing land, so he asked to build a seawall. The local officials said, that's fine, great. But at the EU level, they said, no, you can't do that because there's a rare sea snail that lives there, so it's not allowed. So I wonder if these early regulations that Trump, long before he became US president, had to tackle, if that actually had made him have a very negative view on all the rules and regulations that the EU represents. So perhaps they need a little more the EU needs to do a better job in DC, especially to get the word out, because most people don't even understand how the EU works in the US, unfortunately. So I think they need to really get the message out, help people understand what the EU really is, and that way they can promote their own interests. They've really been kind of not very good at doing that and communicating the value of the EU.
Stephen, to what extent is Europe looking at this as a storm that can be weathered until it passes, that in 4 years' time, under a different president, who knows, perhaps we'll see a return to business as usual? And can the 27 sovereign EU states speak with one voice? I know Theresa said there was a lot of coming together, but can they do that? Can they speak with one voice in their response to this change in approach from the US to the EU? And do they suspect that perhaps President Trump's ultimate aim is to drive a wedge between EU states and perhaps push for its disintegration?
Lots of good questions. It reminds me of the old New Hampshire phrase that you can't get there from here. I think it's very hard to go backwards in time. The Trump period will end, that's for sure. We don't know what will happen after that. Most Americans like Europe. Most Americans support NATO. Most Americans are mistrustful of Russia and Vladimir Putin. So that's the bedrock. But there is, in the Trump people, and you see it more in J.D. Vance than in Trump. I think Theresa's right. Trump resents the regulatory power of Brussels, and so do all the tech bros that are surrounding Trump. But J.D. Vance seems to have an ideological distaste for Europe. He expressed that at the Munich Security Conference. He's expressed it in that Signal chat. He thinks Europe has failings in its democracy. He doesn't believe it's full on board with free speech. It's too woke for him. I don't think Trump feels that strongly ideologically, but Vance is kind of pushing this issue. So if you're Europe, you ask yourself, okay, we can spend more money on defense, and we can buy more F-35s, and we can buy more American equipment if that's what we want to do, but it won't change the sense we have that the U.S. thinks we're somehow flawed. And I think that's been the shock as much as anything else. Now, the EU, 27 sovereign states, it was never meant to be a nation. It was never meant to be a defense entity. It was a peace project. It was meant for trade and has enormous power, which is one reason why the Trump people don't like it, because it can fight back on issues like tariffs, counter tariffs. But I think the EU is adapting, though countries are doing it at a slightly different pace. There are some countries that just would like to pretend, as you suggested, Adrian, that we can go back to where we were. But there are other countries, particularly like Germany, which has really come to terms with a new America and a new Europe, and seems to be at long last taking up its responsibilities. So it's a transitional time, but I think it is heading toward a Europe that is more aggressive in its own defense.
Niall, speaking of J.D. Vance, as Stephen was, after the US Vice President's visit to Greenland and his rather undiplomatic comments there, and of course President Trump's previous comments about US plans to annex the territory, possibly by force, what happens next? Would the US really take Greenland by force, by military force? I mean, what's to stop it?
Well, that's the question, what's to stop it? It does seem like an extraordinary and bizarre idea. But then the population of Greenland is around about 56,000. Obviously no match for a military of the might of the United States, nor would Denmark be any match for the military of the United States. I do think that it is on balance just too bizarre and too crazy an idea to go for, but one never rules anything out with President Trump, who has said that the United States must have Greenland. Theresa noted earlier in the conversation that Greenland has in the past been a subject of American strategic interest, to say the very least. Adrian, I just want to briefly go back to a point that Stephen mentioned, which I think is really important. He talked about the fact that the American population is largely supportive of NATO, skeptical of Russia, and so on and so forth. That is true, and we don't want to underestimate the extent to which that sentiment still survives. But I do think it is fascinating the degree to which Trump himself has shifted the Republican Party on the issue of Russia and Ukraine in a really marked way. I mean, the Republican Party, of course, was traditionally the more hawkish, the more inclined to be anti-Soviet in the old days, and then skeptical of Russian intentions. And now you see a Republican Party very firmly in Donald Trump's grip, shifting to a much more, mixed position, and elected office holders really buying into the Trump line. So I think that's important and has importance beyond the Russia-Ukraine issue.
Okay, let's pick that up with Theresa. We'll come back to Greenland in just a moment. Theresa, to what extent does all of this play into President Putin's hands? What are we to make of Trump's apparent admiration for Vladimir Putin? What does all of this mean for Europe and for Ukraine?
Well, this is where Europe really has lost their mind. That's how they see the U.S. as an adversary, because their perception is that President Trump is getting closer to Putin, and some have described it as trying to do a reverse Kissinger, trying to pull Russia away from China for the larger geopolitical interests of the United States. Do I think that's going to work? No, but I think Trump is trying to do that. And the one thing that you could say that has benefited this, it has actually given Russia a better position vis-a-vis China, because it was pretty much like a vassal state to China, which Russia would never want to acknowledge. But by these talks with Trump and this kind of almost repositioning, it's too early to say what's going to happen. But I think that there's less pressure, perhaps, on Moscow to share advanced technologies with China. It gives Russia a little more room for maneuver. Nevertheless, it's not over yet. I think the Europeans are just thinking that the U.S. is embracing Russia, period, end of story. Now, Trump is already seeing that Putin is not fulfilling his end of the bargain. Trump has said that it's, the author of The Art of the Deal, he recognizes what Putin is doing, that he's slow-walking talks, that Trump even said, I did that in my own real estate deals. So I think Trump recognizes what Putin is doing. He wants to try to bring peace to this region. The way he's doing it has really upset many EU allies, but it's not done yet. So we have a lot to wait and see how things, this is an ongoing process. The Europeans were very upset that they were not invited to the table also. That was a big issue. So I would say that The other major thing that I think Europeans tend to forget about, and I agree with Stephen, I mean, the Europeans do not speak with one voice on any of this. And you have 27 EU member states, you have 32 members of NATO, there's some, overlapping. But I think that Spain has a different view on the war in Ukraine than, say, Poland, which is right on the front. So it's very difficult to get them all to speak with one voice. And it's even more difficult to get them to speak with one voice about policy towards China. So this is something that's a high priority for the US. So this is also possibly another area of contention in the future. And because the transatlantic relationship is undergoing strains, and we shouldn't forget, this isn't the first time. There have been many times, and the transatlantic relationship has remained, after Vietnam, the war in Iraq, there's been a lot of issues that created tension, but it always kind of came through.
Theresa, we're almost out of time. Stephen, I want to come back to Greenland, but feel free to chip in on that if you want to. How would Europe respond if the US were to take Greenland by force? Would it actually show some teeth, or just back down and give President Trump what he wants? I mean, if there's nothing to stop the US taking Greenland by force, what choice does the EU have?
Well, it's a hypothetical, first of all, and the EU wouldn't have much of a choice. The problem actually would be more with NATO, because Denmark, like Canada, is a member of NATO, and Greenland is covered by NATO's Article 5. And frankly, Trump can do whatever he wants in Greenland without taking it over. I mean, the U.S. has defense responsibilities there, and the Danes are saying, just tell us what we can do together. You want to talk about minerals, we'll talk about minerals. So I just think, yeah, it could happen, but I don't expect it to happen. And if it did happen, it would cause an enormous ruckus. I worry about Panama, too, by the way. But the Danes have been going around the EU telling everybody to take a breath, don't make it worse, let us deal with the Trump people. And in fact, if you look at the Vance visit, the Danes will argue that working with Washington, they de-escalated the visit, because Vance and his wife did not visit the Capitol. They didn't try to go into people's homes. There was no big demonstration. He just went to the American base, made a speech, and left. So for the Danes, and for the Greenlandics too, I think this was a much better outcome than it could have been.
There, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it. Many thanks indeed to Niall, Stanage, Theresa, Fallon, and Stephen Erlanger for being with us today. And thank you for watching. You can see the programme again at any time by going to the website at aljazeera.com. For further discussion, join us at our Facebook page. You'll find that at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And, of course, you can join the conversation on X. Our handle there at AJ Inside Story. From me, Adrian, Finighan, and the team here in Doha. Thanks for being with us. We'll see you again. Bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.